Last time we spoke about the second Russian counteroffensive over the heights. Night operations opened the action, scouts moved in the darkness, wires were cut, and Hill 52 fell before dawn, followed by Changkufeng as dawn pressed the front. The Russians responded with a heavy counterattack, tanks, aircraft, and sustained artillery, yet the Japanese adapted quickly, shifting guns and reinforcing sectors to hold the crest. By the 5th of August, Japanese and Soviet forces fought in a fragmented front across multiple sectors: Hill 52, Tron Kuong, Changkufeng, and Lake Kazan. Japanese commanders coordinated between infantry, engineers, and mountain artillery, while seeking long-range support from the Kwangtung Army. Soviet artillery sought to disrupt lines of communication and press from the crest line with massed tanks and airstrikes. Despite intense bombardment and repeated tank assaults, the Japanese regimental guns, anti-tank teams, and close-quarters defense bore the brunt of the defense, inflicting heavy Soviet losses. Yet in the end, the Japanese had yet again repelled the enemy from the heights. This episode is The End Was Near for Changkufeng. Hello and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. And perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Now, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Perhaps you want to hear me talk more off the cuff. Over on Echoes of War, we just released another politically incorrect history, where me and my co-hosts just speak frankly about things we're interested in, always related to history, of course, but in a uncuffed manner, meaning we drink a lot and probably swear. Also, if you're looking to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 30 episodes and ongoing at this point, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. While the frontline fighting raged on August the 6th, Tokyo moved to supply the 19th Division with the coveted long-range artillery and anti-aircraft support. In the evening, the Korea Army officially learned from the AGS that, by imperial order, the Kwangtung Army would add to the strength already, informally approved, 4 7.5cm field guns, 2 15cm cannons, 2 10cm railway guns, and 2 7.5cm anti-aircraft guns. The North China Area Army would also provide some mobile anti-aircraft units. The Korea Army estimated that the field and heavy artillery reinforcements would reach the town of Tumen by August the 8th. The new guns were expected to ease the division's pressure in due course. The fighting continued on the 7th. The 75th Infantry observed that despite the Russians' vigorous attacks aimed at capturing Hill 52 and Changkufeng on August the 6th, they had failed at both objectives and they were repelled with heavy losses. Because of the Soviets' defeat at Changkufeng, they seemed determined to seize Hill 52 on the 7th. Most of the shallow and isolated Japanese positions at Hill 52 had been shattered by bombardment. Some men retrieved Japanese corpses still piled atop of one another. The wounded were to proceed to the rear by themselves. Many had not eaten since the morning of the 6th, yet morale still remained high. It was decided to knock out the Soviets' advancing tanks under the cover of darkness, employing infantry and engineers. At 3 a.m., these elements moved against the armor about 150 meters behind the Russian wire, killed some advancing infantry, and destroyed 2 tanks. The infantry platoon leader, Warrant Officer Kanioka, jumped aboard a tank, pried it open, and fought with his sword as blood was dripping down the blade. The eastern sky brightened as he stood there smiling and holding his bloodied sword. At that moment, Private First Class Kimura exploded a grenade inside the tank, which promptly blew up. The assault force returned safely at dawn. At dawn, from heavy weapon positions 300 meters to the front, the Soviets opened fire, exploiting gaps between the smashed armor. Since about 4 a.m., 60 Russian tanks had been moving south or on the far side of Kazan. By daybreak, more than 10 machines could be seen in the dip northeast of Hill 52, with several dozen other tanks newly active along Hill 29's crestline as infantry deployed in the gullies. At 5:30, Russian artillery began firing from all directions. In addition to the shelling from Gaho, Hill 29, and Manchan, the Soviets directed flank fire against Hill 52 using 2 rapid-fire guns 700 meters northeast and 3 mountain guns on the slopes of Tron Kuong. As the works at Hill 52 were progressively pulverized, Sato dispatched reinforcements from the 76th Regiment there. Around 11 a.m., the Russian barrage intensified and became even more accurate. Positions were destroyed one by one, and casualties were rising. A new apex of fury occurred between 1:30 p.m. and 2:30, when a pale smoke blanketed the region, producing a ghastly impression. Russian planes bombed and strafed Hill 52 from 11 a.m. onwards. A raid by 12 bombers against the western slopes occurred at about 1:30 p.m. It was particularly fierce, though many bombs fell harmlessly into the 2 men. The Russian lines were built up gradually, and all types of Soviet weapons were employed. From 2:30 p.m., about 100 Russians approached, led by 4 tanks. They penetrated the defensive positions. Close-quarter counterattacks were launched by elements of 3 Japanese infantry companies, a machine gun platoon, and an engineer platoon. One officer recalled, "It was tough and costly fighting. Men were overrun by tanks, some losing limbs." 9 engineers linked up with the infantry, placing explosives under the tank turrets and blowing up 2 machines, during the crisis with tanks and infantry overrunning the lines. From the right wing in the 11th Company sector, the Japanese fought fiercely against Soviet heavy weapons and infantry who had advanced at point-blank range. Master Sergeant Suzuki, acting company commander, on his own initiative, ordered the main force to counterattack. Through coordinated action, the Japanese knocked out 4 tanks that had penetrated their positions. 2 enemy battalions that had come close bravely were nearly wiped out. Total Soviet strength committed in the sector amounted to about 3 battalions and 40 tanks. Japanese losses on the Hill 52 front were heavy indeed. 74 had been killed and 85 were wounded. 159 out of the 328 men in action. The remnants of 1 infantry company were commanded by a superior private. Sergeants led 2 other infantry and 2 machine gun companies. 7 of the 13 heavy weapons were inoperable. Meanwhile, the 9th Company elements defending Noguchi Hill, 800 meters southeast of Tron Kuong. By about 5 a.m. on the 7th, Soviet troops facing the hill numbered 200 infantry, 5 tanks, and 2 rapid-fire guns. From positions set up the previous night along the lake, the Russians opened fire at dawn, while 50 soldiers moved to attack with the tanks in support. Captain Noguchi's men poured fire on the ground and inflicted heavy losses. But the Russians who possessed superior supporting fire fought their way forward until about 40 minutes. Then they got within 70 meters. The Soviet tanks disappeared into a dead angle near the lakeshore. When the fog lifted about 6 a.m., the Russians on the southeastern slope of Tron Kuong fired down at Noguchi Hill with 4 heavy machine guns. 7 tanks advancing anew from the gully northeast of Hill 52 came as close as 80 to 200 meters. They deployed in a circle and they opened fire. By now, 8 Japanese had been killed and 5 were wounded. Most of the light machine guns and grenade dischargers had been crippled, and all 3 heavy weapons were out of action. The Russians attacked again at 8 a.m., hurling grenades and shouting as they did so. A dozen tanks operated in support of 2 infantry companies. The Japanese responded with grenades, as yellow and black smoke masked the heights, and the scene was extremely impressive. Desperate hand-to-hand combat raged along the sector for half an hour until the Soviets fell back after suffering enormous losses. At 10:40 a.m., the Russians assaulted with infantry from the southeast front and from the Changkufeng direction, aided by tanks from the zone between. Captain Noguchi sortied with his remnants. They charged the Russians and they drove them off. In this fighting, however, he was shot in the chest, and most of his subordinates were killed or wounded. Somehow the captain stayed on his feet. He and 6 survivors threw grenades at the Russians, who were now behind the Japanese. Then he led a last charge back to the highest positions. Once the enemy had been evicted, Captain Noguchi finally collapsed. Only 3 or 4 soldiers were in fighting condition. The captain begged them to report to Sato, but they refused to abandon him. The men managed to help him down to the rear. It was at 11:30 a.m. Captain Noguchi's unit, which had fought bravely since the first combat on August 6th, had been completely annihilated. Of 78 officers and men, 40 lay killed, another 31 were wounded, and the hill had been lost. Meanwhile, Soviet bombardment of Hill 52 had been quite heavy, and phone contact with the regiment was severed. Suddenly, Captain Noguchi appeared at the headquarters, and the regiment finally learnt that the foe had penetrated the defenses. The bleeding captain pleaded for a counterattack and kept trying to return to the fight. Sato had to restrain him by ordering him to leave for the rear. It was true that the position Captain Noguchi had occupied was the key point connecting Hill 52 to Changkufeng, but Sato reasoned that if they held solidly in the latter hills, their defenses would never be in much danger. It would be easy to retake Noguchi Hill at any time by concentrating fire from all of the high ground and by employing artillery once the strength could be spared. Around sunset, however, Sato received an order from a brigade, and a request came from Changkufeng that the troops who were bravely fighting had been tied over in the crisis. Reassured, Sato proceeded to Hill 52, cheering on Kojima and his soldiers, and examined the condition of the wounded and the heaped-up corpses. The 75th Infantry estimated that there had been about 900 Russian casualties in the right sector, and that more than 10 tanks and 3 heavy machine guns had been put out of action. The regiment itself had lost 4 officers killed, about 4 wounded. In the entire right sector, which included about 1,332 men in action, 140 had been killed and 180 were wounded. 7 soldiers of the 75th Infantry were also listed as missing in action, but presumed dead. Total casualties, including the missing, as a percentage of those listed as engaged, amounted to about 25% for the right sector unit. On the 7th, the unit had lost 19 machine guns and about 11 grenade dischargers. At 6 p.m. on the 7th, Japanese intelligence estimated that the Russians had committed a grand total of 25 infantry battalions, up 6 from August the 6th, 80 artillery pieces, up 10, and 200 tanks. Situation maps showed 1 Soviet infantry battalion east of Changkufeng, another north of Hill 52, armored infantry and unknown strength east of that hill, and artillery positions northeast of Lake Khasan. On the 7th, spotters had observed 7 large steamers entering Poiziet and Kanxi, as well as a 10,000-ton vessel at Yongmudi. At least 200 or 300 enemy soldiers were in the Karanchin sector, working to strengthen the positions there. Units moving south from Novokiesk included 350 trucks, 60 tanks, and 400 troops. Heading north from the region of the battlefield were 100 trucks and about 150 horsemen. Meanwhile, on the front in the eastern parts of Manchuria, elements of the Kwangtung Army's 8th Division had forcibly ousted a small party of Soviet border trespassers. It seemed the punch had gone out from the Russians in the Hill 52 sector after their thorough defeat on the 6th and 7th of August, but they continued to build up firepower, deploying heavy weapons and artillery observation posts. The bombardments grew more accurate. Even regiment and brigade headquarters lost their last dead angles. By daylight on the 8th, 2 Soviet infantry battalions plus tanks were deployed on the Hill 52 front. Their main forces were distributed along the line 800 meters from the Japanese, and snipers and machine gunners held positions about 300 meters away. Each time they detected movement, they sniped at us and interfered with our observation. From about 9 a.m. onwards, the Japanese sustained scattered artillery fire. At 1:30 p.m., there was a bombing raid by 15 aircraft, but no casualties were incurred. Soviet guns pounded Hill 52 around 6:30 p.m., and the Japanese suffered 4 or 5 casualties, but morale was generally high, and they sought to strengthen and repair their positions throughout the night. On the Changkufeng front, which had drawn rather serious attention, Russian heavy guns opened slow fire at about 5 a.m. from the east of Khasan, and then from Manchan. Through the night of the 7th and 8th of August, Soviet infantry had assembled near the lake crossing. Russian troop strength increased beyond 1.5 battalions. The defenders ran out of grenades and they had to resort to rocks, but by 10 a.m. the Soviet assault waves began to weaken after 5 hours of fierce resistance. Supporting the Japanese lines had been barrages by grenade launchers, flank fire by heavy machine gun platoons at Chongchongfeng, and support by mountain artillery. At around 10:30 a.m. the attackers fled to Lake Khasan. The battlefield quieted, but enemy snipers dug foxholes 300 meters away. They kept up a persistent fire. The infantry mounted repeated attacks in varying strength. Since morning, the mountain gun and 2 battalion guns at Fangchongting had engaged infantry and machine guns that appeared on the middle of the Changkufeng crest, as well as in the Hill 52 area. The timely fire from these guns caused severe losses, especially to Russian observation posts. But Lieutenant Maoka, who commanded the mountain platoon from Changkufeng, was wounded badly at 10:30 a.m. The Mountain Battalion also fired at targets in the Changkufeng sector from the Korean side of the two men. At about 1:20 p.m., the Russians pressed new attacks against Changkufeng from three sides, using a total of 2 companies and 3 tanks. Although they got close and they attacked persistently, they were driven off each time. These afternoon efforts were not very vigorous. Fighters strafed at low altitude, and more than 10 bombers attacked near 3 p.m., igniting fires in the village of Fangzhongting. The raids by planes and guns caused frequent cuts in signal lines again. At 6:50 a.m. on the 8th, Soviet forces in the left sector resumed their efforts until they were pinned down at about 100 meters, and they had to dig in. Excluding the spotter posts, everyone had to enter shelters from warning till all clear signs. Meanwhile, Sato estimated that although enemy attacks were aimed mainly against Changkufeng, there existed some danger that hostile forces would cross the two men near Yongguangping and launch a sudden attack against the left rear, as actions in that area have become quite pronounced. He issued an order at 5 p.m. to everyone, superiors and subordinates alike. They had to overcome exhaustion and make nighttime guardings rigorous, leave the foe not the slightest opening between friendly battalions or from the shores of the Tumen River. Sutaka estimated in the morning of the 8th that the Russians were trying to generate propaganda advantageous to them at home and abroad by staking their honor and seizing Changkufeng quite quickly. From the standpoint of overall political tactics, it was imperative to thwart their intentions. The enemy relied consistently on elements that remained on the crest line southeast of Changkufeng and served as a base. They must be deprived of that attack base. If his assault plans were to be successful, the 37th Brigade would require reinforcements. The 1st Battalion-sized elements of Cho's infantry were beginning to arrive. As an initial step, Han Yu's battalion could cross the Tumen and then join the brigade, while the main body of the regiment, due that afternoon, would be ready to enter the lines. The division chief of staff issued an order in the name of Sutaka, stipulating that the division would secure its positions while adhering to the great policy of non-expansion. At about 10:30 p.m., Morimoto speculated that the Russians were hoping for a good fortune of retaking Changkufeng. Strict guard measures were enjoyed. Eventually, before midnight, Sutaka met Cho at Seikaku Station. To implement Sutaka's request that the Russian foothold southeast of Changkufeng be wiped out, Morimoto decided in the morning to employ the new battalion from Cho's regiment. But since Han Yu's unit was delayed by enemy fire, Morimoto had to turn to the reserve 76 Regiment. At about 4 p.m., Okido was told to prepare an attack, using 1 infantry battalion and 1 engineer squad. The mission was to take advantage of darkness to expel the foe remaining on Changkufeng, secure the heights in concert with elements on the hill, and then smash any serious attack at night. At about 5 p.m., Okido issued his detailed order. Enemy elements were located near the cliff close to the northern top of Changkufeng. Apparently hostile bases existed in scattered fashion on the southern slopes as well as rather large bases on the middle of Akahage, or Red Bald Hill, formerly held by Captain Gochi's company. The regiment was to drive these forces north of Hill 52. The 3rd Battalion commander, Major Hashimoto Seishiro, was to direct both companies' assaults, and once the foe was ousted, secure the locations until dawn, after which they could return to the reserve unit. On the 8th, at about 7:30 p.m., Hashimoto proceeded with his battalion to the foot of Changkufeng, and he conferred with Major Sato and Captain Shimamura, the majors commanding the units from which they were going to be cooperating. The assault units moved out from Zhangchongfeng, but their timing was thrown off by a half hour of artillery checking fire from the northeast of the lake. At 8:50 p.m., Captain Iwai's 10th Company, supported by a machine gun platoon, attacked the rock corner on the eastern side of Changkufeng. After cutting down Soviet sentries, the Japanese rushed in. 40 to 50 Russian soldiers retreated towards Akahage. On that hill, there had been about 30 Soviet troops to begin with, but their strength had been built up to 2 companies plus tanks and some infantry guns. The Russians laid down violent small arms fire, causing 17 casualties in a short period, after which about 40 enemy soldiers sought to counterattack. The Japanese drove back this effort, readied their own offensive, and continued to launch close assaults against the heavy machine gun nest at the rock corner. Simultaneously, Captain Shidata's 7th Company jumped off with about 5 attached demolition engineers. The 1st platoon broke through the entanglements and then cut down lookouts, while the 2nd platoon proceeded to mop up the footholds on the northern side, about 10 Russian soldiers who dotted the slope at 4 locations. In the process, the company ran into a position Iwai had been attacking. Terrain and enemy fire dictated a detour south of the ridge line. Shidada's men moved up behind Iwai on the right, joining Hashimoto's command. The battalion commander consolidated his lines and then he directed a reconnaissance preparatory to attack against Akahage. Hours would pass. Okido, at the command post, decided it might be wiser to wait till daybreak and call for artillery support. Hashimoto then issued his own instructions from the eastern salient, cautioning his men to dig in well. Near 4 a.m., the redeployments were completed, but construction did not progress due to the rocky terrain. Soldiers were barely able to scope knee-high firing trenches by daylight. Total Russian losses on the 8th were estimated to exceed 1,500. More than 100 tanks were claimed publicly, and then it was confirmed that since the 1st, 6 planes had been shot down, 2 of which fell behind Japanese lines. In Tokyo, the War Ministry and the Gaimusho denied categorically that the Russians had ever retaken Tron Kuong. Soviet troops had attempted to rush positions 600 feet from the crest at about 2 p.m. After 2.5 hours of furious hand-to-hand fighting, they were beaten off, with presumably heavy casualties on both sides. Soviet tanks reported moving north from Poziepe, though it remained unclear whether this indicated withdrawal or a strategic movement. Right sector casualties were relatively light on August 8th. 8 were killed, 41 were wounded, the 75th Infantry suffering 5 of the 38 of these respectively. Officer casualties were proportionately high. 2 wounded in the 75th Regiment, 1 in the 76th, and 4 in the Mountain Artillery. Personnel rosters of the 75th Regiment, as of July the 30th and August 8th, showed a reduction from 1,403 to about 826. It's 41%. The cumulative effect of Japanese losses and the scale of Soviet commitment troubled the Korea Army. Tsutaka reported Japanese casualties as, through August 2nd, 45 killed, 120 wounded. From the 3rd to the 5th of August, 25 killed, 60 wounded. And since August 6th, kills unknown, 200 wounded. Remarkably, the same casualty totals were released publicly by the War Ministry on the night of the 8th. On the 9th of August, at about 3:20 p.m., the Japanese were hit by a very intense barrage from Hill 29. The mountain gun was damaged by shell fire and had been moved to the foot of Huangchongting. Tanaka had ordered his artillery to conduct long-range artillery neutralization and communications cut-off fire, a short-range neutralization as well as checking fire. The accuracy of the Japanese artillery elements had improved, and the power of their guns had been enhanced greatly. On the left, from about 5:30 a.m., Sato dispatched an anti-tank platoon under the cover of mist to finish off the immobilized Soviet tanks whose main armament was still operational and which had done some severe firing the day before. As the day wore on, spirits rose, for the men heard the roar of friendly 15-centimeter cannons laying down some mighty neutralization fire against the enemy artillery. Near 2:15 p.m., Russian troops were detected creeping forward in the woods 400 meters away from the right. Supporting mountain artillery wiped this threat out in short order. Tsutaka decided to move his divisional headquarters to Sekaku and his combat command post to Matsuotsu. Anxiety about the Utatsu sector to the north had diminished greatly. In addition, the entire strength of the division had already been brought to the front. Lastly, dealings with Seoul and Tokyo levels had now become rather secondary in importance. Tsutaka could discern the steady, disturbing exhaustion of his frontline troops. On the other hand, newly arrived Cho was raring to go. After receiving authorization from Tsutaka, Cho allowed Nakajima's battalion to cross the river at Matsuotsu, but kept Osoga's battalion on the Korean bank as a divisional reserve. Since Tanaka had surmised that the Russians' intention was to direct their main offensive effort against the Japanese right wing, it seemed best to transfer the mountain guns to strengthen the right sector positions. The brigade order, at 5:30 p.m., endorsed Tanaka's shift of defensive emphasis, particularly with regard of the artillery and the new elements of Cho's regiment. Morimoto added that the core of the Soviet assault force southeast of Changkufeng amounted to about 2 infantry battalions. Sato accordingly ordered Obo's battalion to integrate its heavy firepower and deliver swift fire in a timely fashion. Soon thereafter, Obo discerned a massed battalion of Russian infantry who had been hauled up by trucks on the northeastern skirt of Changkufeng. He unleashed every available weapon, organic and attached, at about 7:30 p.m. The Soviets seemed taken by complete surprise. They showed extreme bewilderment and dispersed in an instant. The right sector unit estimated on the 9th of August that they had caused about 450 casualties, stopped about 5 tanks, and knocked out 1 light artillery piece and 7 heavy machine guns. Japanese casualties in the right sector had amounted to about 28 deaths and 43 wounded. Ammunition expenditures were considerably higher than that in the 8th. During the night of the 9th, the 74th Infantry reinforcements crossed the Tumen steadily. In the early hours, Okido concluded that Soviet attack designs had been frustrated for the time being. The Hill 52 front was relatively calm. Soviet automatic weapons and riflemen were still deployed about 300 meters from the Japanese positions, where they sniped selectively. Russian artillery was quiet, apparently as a result of the movement of the main Japanese artillery force to the right wing and the arrival of long-range guns. The 75th Regiment command post at Fangchongting was a focal point of Japanese artillery activity. Firing began at 7:10 a.m. when 4 battalion guns engaged and smashed 2 Soviet mountain pieces. As for the Soviet ground assaults, one company attacked at Changkufeng as early as 5:20 a.m. under the cover of fog, but they were driven off after 40 minutes. The Russians struck again from 3 directions in formidable strength between 9 and 10 a.m. Morimoto, growing concerned about the danger of interruptions through gaps between Changkufeng and Chaochaofeng, sent elements of Nakajima's battalion to Chongchungfeng. Since the right wing of the Russians atop Changkufeng were spilling onto the western slopes, at 10:30 a.m. Nakajima and his heavy machine guns and battalion guns laid down some strong fire from the peak of Chongchungfeng. Meanwhile, heavy weapons from the left sector were also contributing to repulse the morning assaults. A battalion of Soviet infantry attacked Changkufeng all afternoon. Fierce gunfire by the 75th Regiment at about 2 p.m. routed troops massing on the slopes facing the red flag. Considerable losses were inflicted on 75 Russians sighted northeast of Hill 52. An enemy company on the Kasan shore and another 2 east of Akahage Hill were attempting to occupy positions from which to strike Fangchongting with the support of 2 rapid-fire guns. By 5 p.m., the Russians had been repulsed by energetic fire of Japanese small arms, battalion guns, and artillery. Soviet forces dispersed towards the lakeshore and Hill 52, leaving many corpses behind. The last important firing by Japanese battalion guns at Fangchongting on the 10th was a mission against the eastern slopes of Changkufeng at about 6 p.m. Thereafter, the battle zone grew quite still. Over in the left sector, Sato concluded to secure Changkufeng, it would be best to reinforce flank fire instead of concentrating on the direct attack or defense of Changkufeng district. He therefore made arrangements with Okido to borrow 1 machine gun platoon and assign it to Obo. As of 5:30 a.m., enemy troops were still holding a line 300 meters from the positions of Obo's right battalion and about 800 to 1,000 meters ahead of Takenouchi's left battalion. Shortly after, good news was received at the left sector command post. The last battalion of the 73rd Regiment was to have left Nanam at about 4 p.m. on the 9th of August. They would be arriving in the near future. On the right wing of the left sector, the Russians facing Kadokura's company began to operate energetically from about 9 a.m., advancing in 2 lines, 150 meters apart, with a total strength of 1 company and 2 platoons. They were supported by forces on some high ground north of Kasan, Akahage. Kadokura waited for the enemy to close in about 200 meters before ordering his men to open fire. It was particularly effective with the flanking fire by the machine gun company and by elements of Okura's company. Many heavy artillery shells were hitting the Japanese lines now, but defensive fire pinned down the attacking infantry for a while, 100 meters from the breastworks. Then 30 or 40 Soviet soldiers, covered by firepower, worked forward as close as 30 meters, hurling grenades and giving every indication of mounting a charge. The Japanese responded with grenades in turn. At the same time, the left flank squad of Kadokura's company was being annihilated. Thus encouraged, Russian assault troops plunged close, whereupon Kadokura assembled his available men, a dozen or so, from the command teams and runners, and he grappled with the foe at point-blank range. An ammunition man joined in the melee and broke up the Soviet assault by expert use of hand grenades. The second echelon gradually fell back at around 10:30 a.m. in the face of heavy fire laid down by machine guns and Okura's company. The Russians appeared to be adjusting their deployment, but made no further efforts to close in. At Changkufeng, 2 to 3 enemy companies were approaching the crest. Left sector raiding fire caused them to flee, however. Japanese casualties in the old right sector had been 9 killed and 22 wounded on the 10th. It was estimated that Soviet casualties had amounted to maybe 600 killed or wounded, with 5 heavy machine guns knocked out. By this time, the Soviets had committed their maximum infantry and artillery strength, 27 battalions and 100 guns, the same as on the 9th, but up to 17 battalions and 60 units since August the 3rd. Higher headquarters reported no tanks at the front. though the 75th Infantry situation maps indicated some Soviet armor still faced the Hill 52 sector. Although Japanese officers insisted that Changkufeng Hill remained in Japanese possession, they acknowledged increased casualties due to the accuracy of Soviet shelling. Losses were not as severe as might have been expected because the enemy did not take their time in charges with the bombardment. Japanese troops lay in trenches and they met the attackers with grenades. Every combat unit of the 19th Division had been committed. Nevertheless, the maimed and fresh battalions had amounted to a combined maximum strength of just 12 infantry battalions and 37 artillery pieces, primarily 75mm mountain guns, without any armor or aircraft support. These forces had to cope with 27 enemy infantry battalions and over 100 artillery pieces, including many long-range guns, as well as sizable tank and aerial units. Every echelon, regiment, division, and army had voiced the need for troop replacements and reinforcements. By the evening of the 10th, the situation had deteriorated to the point that the divisional chief of staff sent Seoul a very long and painful message that ended with, "There is a danger of radical change in combat situation in a few days if matters go on. It is estimated that this division has only 1 or 2 days left in which it can retain definite freedom of action, initiative to advance or retreat. Even if overall situation should develop to our advantage in the next 3 or 4 days, we ought to be patient from broader standpoints and be satisfied with our own achievement. That Japanese army has manifested its strength against enemy till now. While we do retain freedom of action, it would be appropriate to solve this incident now through a speedy diplomatic negotiation. Such measures are entirely up to the Korea Army and the High Command, but so far as the division is concerned, there is no other way except, of course, to make desperate efforts to maintain the occupational line for the sake of the mission. Please take these matters into sympathetic consideration and conduct appropriate measures urgently." I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Night raids and artillery opened the fight, with Hill 52 and Tron Kuong changing hands amidst intense Soviet tank and air assaults. Japanese forces, aided by engineers, infantry, and mountain guns, mounted tenacious defenses, repelling repeated Soviet breakthroughs while sustaining very heavy casualties. By August the 10th, Japanese divisions faced mounting exhaustion and warnings of potential strategic shifts, while both sides suffered substantial casualties and material loss.